Thank you again for accepting this interview. It's a pleasure. Seriously, let's start from the beginning. So, as Memorie di Angelina has become a love source for authentic Italian recipes, what inspired you to start this blog? How did your grandmother influence you?
Yeah, well, she was obviously a great part of the inspiration. But to be honest, I mean, the blog started almost by accident. I'd recently moved back to the States from Italy at the time. And I was also reconnecting with some of my friends here through Facebook and other means. And so I started to share recipes with my friends. And then a few of them may have expressed some interest. And, oh, we were in Italy for 10 years,
Mhm.
I started on Facebook on my profile. At the time, you could write notes. I don't even know if this exists as a feature on Facebook anymore. But anyway, I would write notes with the recipes and share them with friends, etc. But that was very limiting. So I decided to actually start a blog at that point. Different platform was like Blogger, I think, at the time. It was, I think, it exists for kind of very basic blogs. So I started doing that, and yeah, the rest, in a sense, is history. I mean, to my surprise, people other than my friends started looking at the blog, reading the blog, commenting, et cetera, et cetera. So I said, oh, this is interesting. Let me just keep going. And then here I am. It was started in 2009, I think. So, here we are 14, 15 years later, and still going strong. But
Mhm.
because I just found it was that I got the bug, I thought it's just a lot of fun sharing and especially getting the reactions from people. And when you hear from, especially Italian Americans often write and say, "Oh, this was my grandmother used to make
Yes,
this. I lost the recipe. I forgot how to make it, and now finally I can taste that again after so many years." That's a lovely feeling when you get a message like that.
yes. So, would you say this is the most surprising aspect of this blog?
Number of surprises. One is, yeah, I was surprised that the popularity of it in a way, because, as I said, that wasn't my intention. My intention was just like to have a place where I could share with a few
Because you
friends.
have a passion for cooking.
Yes,
You're
yeah,
about, yeah.
lifelong passion for cooking that was inspired by my grandmother, of course, and those Sunday dinners in particular. We used to go almost every Sunday to my grandmother's house. And of course, it was the typical, very leisurely, starting around noontime. Everyone come back from church, and it wouldn't be over until 6, 7, 8
Yes.
o'clock
Oh,
at
yes. It
night,
can go on forever.
you know. So it was one of these, and that was like a very seminal experience for me. Sharing that with a few friends that were curious, etc. But then, as I said, things took off like that. So that the success of it was the first surprise. I guess the other surprise, I guess, was how people react to the recipes and to the blog itself in different ways. Sometimes very, as I said, very heartwarming, very gratifying. But what I also found out that people were, and I think especially Americans, have a need for precision because when I started
Yeah.
out, my recipes were almost not recipes. They were just kind of stories almost about, oh, you make this, you put in a little bit of this, you do that.
Just like
Uh,
grandmas would do.
yeah, yeah, exactly. And then people are like, well, I don't know how to make this. You tell me how many, when you say a pinch of salt, is that half a teaspoon? Is it a 1 teaspoon? I realized I had to adjust my style over time because many readers require
Mm.
a lot of precision, especially in measurements.
Yes.
Because I tried to be very specific in terms of technique because I knew that not everyone, has different levels of skill, etc. So I was usually very good I think, in describing how to make the dish in terms of the method.
Mhm.
But I was often pretty ambiguous about amounts and measures because I don't measure typically when I cook, you
Well,
know?
that's pro level.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
When you've been cooking for a long enough time, you just kind of you can use your eye and you know how
Mhm.
much to. But so I had to go back and kind of deconstruct what I was doing, if you like, and remember to, oh, before I throw this in, let me see how much this is, etc., and make a note. So that was, I guess, maybe not, shouldn't be surprising, perhaps, but it was a little bit not what I was expecting, I guess. There are certain, I've had a few posts which I wouldn't call them throwaway posts, but it's something I did quickly one week because I try to blog once a week if I can.
Hmm.
And then there are some weeks where I'm just very busy, so I just throw something together very quickly. And some of those are some of my most popular. Huh? And then others which I take a long time and do a lot of
Oh, yeah.
research and really, and okay, they do okay, but nothing special. One pattern I've seen, which is interesting, is the familiar is often more popular than the kind of unusual. And
Yep.
I'm actually surprised by that because you would think it'd be the opposite way. Because, like, for example, in my last two posts, I did one 2 weeks ago about ribollita, no, this
Hmm.
Italian minestrone dish, and it did very well, very popular, and a lot of comments, a lot of engagement, a lot of traffic, which was fine. Of course, it's lovely to see that. Now, the last week, I did one that for me was very special on puntarelle, which is this,
Yeah.
oh, you probably know, the Roman salad with the anchovy and garlic,
Hmm.
which was one of my favorite things to eat when I was living in Rome. And I finally found a source where I could get it here. So I was really excited about
That's
this. So
great.
I did this special post. It meant a lot to me because it was so special to be able to find this after so many
Hmm.
years. And yes, it did okay, but just normal. And I thought, and a lot of people were
Hmm.
to me saying, "Oh, I didn't know this even existed," etc. Um, so whereas everyone practically these days knows what a ribolita is, right? It's very internationally famous, and so that's an example of how um, people react more to things that they know than they don't, I think, which
Hmm.
is ironic. I think it's funny because at least for me, I would be more interested rather than reading the 100th
Yeah,
recipe
because
for
you already know it. So
that
why
you've
why
read a
again?
million times on the internet, something that you didn't know. Oh, let me look at this. I don't know about this. So at least for me, it would be the opposite. I'd be more attracted to the thing that was unknown and something new I wanted to learn about. But apparently, that's not most people. So.
Maybe it goes back to, no, it relates to feeling. Um, like you said before, oh, someone wrote me, oh, that's a recipe that I lost, but now I know how to make this again. It reminds me to my
Mhm.
grandma. So maybe it's more than much more than cuisine. It's about getting back to a feeling that it's
Yeah.
familiar.
Yeah.
What's the process of posting a recipe?
As I said, I was sharing basically recipes from my grandmother on the one hand, and then on the other hand, recipes I had learned having lived in Rome and traveled in Italy during those 10 years. It was stuff that I had a very direct personal
Mhm.
experience with, etc. But of course, after time, we're closing in on 700 recipes now. So, as wonderful a cook as my grandmother was, her repertoire was not that broad. So, started to branch out. And I really these days, of course, I go back to Italy once or twice a year, and I'm very conscious now, more so than when I was living there, to be
Mhm.
honest, about looking for new dishes and investigating. And when you're living there, you take it a little bit for granted. And plus, I use all the resources I have. I have a big cookbook collection. I mean, I started when I was very young collecting cookbooks in my 20s. I'm now in my 60s, so you can imagine I've got a large library now. I bought a lot of books when, of course, when I was living in Italy. You know this guy, Davide Zambelli? He wrote a new book
Yes.
from the
Mhm.
Alto Adige, and he wrote a book called Un po' più su. It's a very nice
Okay,
book
yeah.
about
I know about the
that
book bag. Yes, I know him.
the cuisine of that region. So I occasionally buy a book, of course, and now in these days you have access to the internet. So of course I look there. I'm an avid viewer of Italian culinary YouTube channels. Giorgione, who
Giorgione, yes, I know him.
Giorgione, no? All these guys. Anyway, so there's a guy down in Calabria that I follow. So I do that and I get inspiration from basically all of those sources. And I've come up with a list, if you like, a kind of a plan for my blog. So I have a very long list of dishes still, even after all these years that I want to present.
Mhm.
And I more or less cycle through the courses. So I try to have a balance of different dishes. So if last week I did antipasto, this week it'll be a pasta or a soup or something like that. And then next
Mhm.
week it'll be
So you
fish.
alternate main dish, second. Okay.
According to the dish, and go through and to the. Sometimes I skip dessert. I'm not a very sweet oriented guy, but I try to more or less cycle through the meal, if you like, as I go
Yeah,
through.
okay. To
Don't
give a
always
complete experience, sort of.
exactly. Try to keep a balance of different kinds of dishes.
Mhm.
Take the dish, um, and I do as much research as I possibly can, all the sources, my cookbooks, the online stuff, the videos, et cetera, et cetera. If I've had it myself, of course, even better. I try to figure out the core of the dish because I don't generally present original dishes. I mean, I don't purport to say, oh, this is my
Right.
invention. Absolutely not. I'm documenting, trying to document something
Mhm.
that exists, if you like, as a cultural phenomenon. Generally traditional dishes, or many dishes have a lot of variations. So what I do is I present the recipe as I kind of decided to make it because I think, this is what appeals to me. Then I will, in the notes, note all of the variations that I have seen in my research afterwards in notes on cooking tips, etc.
Mhm.
And I also add tips in my own experience. This is what a little bit difficult about this recipe, a little bit tricky to make sure to do this or don't do that. So basically, research, writing kind of a skeletal draft, then buying the ingredients, obviously cooking it, photographing it. I mean, that's a big part of it, photography. That was another surprise. I forgot to mention that, how important the visual aspect
Absolutely.
is. When I first started blogging, that what was attracting people was the knowledge I was sharing. And I think that's true to some extent.
Yeah.
But
Yes.
in order to get engagement, it's the visual aspect that is really going to keep, maybe the content is going to keep people coming back, but what attracts them to initially is what they see with their eyes.
Yeah, of course. Well, in Italian, we say you eat first with your eyes and then with the
Yes,
rest. And
exactly.
people are attracted to beauty, generally speaking. So, as you said, the first impact is important.
Had to become a better photographer than I was. And so, I mean, if you go back to some of my very first posts, it's a bit embarrassing, some of the photography. And I'm still learning even after all these years, but I think my photography has gotten pretty good at this point. So, and it also has a didactic purpose, right? Because you want to show them what the dish should look like, do step by step if there's, in a recipe with
Mhm.
photos of different stages. If I think it's useful to do that, you need to know what you're aiming for, right? And so that's also why I do very little so-called food styling. I don't try to alter the food to make it look different than it actually is, because then that completely undercuts the
Right.
purpose.
Previously, you said you were living in Italy, in Rome.
Mm.
So, can we go back, take a step back, and where do you start from? So, why were you in Italy?
Well, I always wanted to live there. I had always had an attraction, being of Italian origin, I guess, a curiosity, an attraction through my family experience,
Yeah.
obviously growing up. And then, I went there, I guess for the first time, I'm maybe 18 years old. I'm trying to remember. It was a long time ago.
Yeah, yeah.
Very long. And I loved it, I really, really enjoyed it. And so I always had in the back of my mind that I wanted to live there one day. And so it took me a while. I was probably in my mid 30s, I guess, by the time I actually went to Rome, but I had a kind of a professional opportunity. I'd been living in Europe anyway, because I had spent, I'm from New York originally. I spent maybe 10 years working on Wall Street as a lawyer, et cetera. That's my kind of personal background. And I decided I wanted to try something completely new. And so I moved to Europe, but not to Italy, actually, initially. It was to Paris, to learn French, because I wanted to go to a school in Switzerland, Lausanne, the famous
Mhm.
hotel school in
Yeah.
Lausanne. I was inspired by the story of this Italian chef, Gualtiero Marchesi.
Mm-hmm.
which you probably heard of. I mean, he was
Yeah, of
very
course.
popular back in
Famous.
when I was doing this is back in the 80s,
Yeah.
90s, in his heyday. So I was kind of following in his footsteps, at least in my own mind. So, but I said, okay, I have to perfect. I knew a little bit of French, but I have to perfect my French, and then I'd go to Switzerland and study at the school, etc. So this was my game plan. It didn't happen because a friend of mine who was a lawyer who I'd worked with in New York had moved to. Actually, she was in Moscow at the time, but she was working with a firm that was based in Vienna, and she said, "Oh, why don't you come work for our firm?" So she lured me back into the legal profession, for better for worse.
Mm-hmm.
Kind of abandoned my aspirations a little bit to be a professional cook, but never, of course, lost my interest in cooking. And so I moved to Vienna after that. And then an opportunity came up to work at one of the UN organizations in Rome, and I grabbed
You
it.
took it. Mm-hmm.
That's how I wound up
Mm-hmm.
in
How
Rome.
long have you been living in Rome?
10
Yeah.
years
Okay, 10 years.
from,
Long. Has an Italian kind of life because Rome is typical. It's
yes.
super busy, so not really the quiet place you can, enjoy life.
For the first 7 years, yeah, right downtown, close to Campo di Fiori.
Hmm.
So, and towards the ghetto, if you know that
Yeah.
area. Um, and so, yeah, it was quite busy. It got busier actually as I lived there. It was quieter when I first lived there, by the way. In the 1990s, it was 95 when I moved there. And then over the years, it became more and more touristy, opening bars, and attracting often very young, rowdy people. So it became noisier and busier and whatever. And so
Time.
at that point, I moved out outside of Rome a little bit, not completely outside of Rome, but close to where I worked. And that was actually quite, pretty quiet. It was a
Mhm.
kind of a semi-rural area, looking out over the hills. You could see in the distance the Colli Albani, and you would see sheep coming. Sometimes you'd have to stop the car
Oh,
because the sheep were crossing the road and
okay,
stuff like.
super quiet place.
Yeah, and you could go down the street and buy wine, and you could buy cheese would come from the milk from the sheep that stopped you in the road, and there was another place where you can buy olive oil and so on. So it was kind of a rural life, but very close to the city. So it was nice in that way.
Mhm. And would you consider moving back?
Yes, I'm actually thinking about it right now as we speak. I'm giving it very serious consideration for a lot of reasons. I mean, there are a lot of motivations, but I guess um, even though I wasn't born there, obviously, there's something about that atmosphere. I feel very much at home. I don't know.
It's in
Sometimes
your genes
home,
somehow,
yeah,
there.
somehow, maybe, I don't know. I just feel like I'm most myself and most at peace with the world and when I was there. If I think about all of the experience, because I've lived in many different places, being an international lawyer, um, it's the place where I most feel like I'm home somehow, even though
Wow.
that's not where I grew up or where I was born. So that's the end. At the end of the day, I guess that's the main motivation. I mean,
Mhm.
there are a lot of other things. The food, of course. I
Oh,
mean,
yeah. Well,
that's
how do you think that would influence your blog?
it's an interesting question. I think in some ways, in most ways, it would be, of course, going to be a huge plus, no? Because I'm blogging about Italian food. So logically, where else, where
Yeah.
better to be doing it from, but in a place where that's where the food is from, that's where you can go. And I would be able to travel very easily, of course, in different regions and really get to in-depth research about
Hmm.
kinds of dishes and food, have a contact, talk to people. I have a number of good foodie friends, people who do blogs or other content who I occasionally get to see if I'm traveling there. It would be nice to have much more contact with them, have kind of a direct contact with the food scene as opposed to through media. I think there is at least one downside, however, um, which is a lot of what I do is to kind of help people create food because my audience is mostly obviously not living in Italy. I do get some traffic, by the way, from Italy, surprisingly, but most of my traffic is from English-speaking countries.
You're facilitating the connection between
Exactly. So I
words.
think of myself as a kind of ambassador. So I think some of the value of the blog is explaining to people that if who are not living in Italy, how to reproduce that food. So what substitutes to find, where you can find such and such ingredient, all of that kind of thing. So from that respect, it's helpful to be outside of Italy because you have a certain you're facing the same challenges as your
Mm.
audience in terms of trying to create these dishes. So I think I need to be kind of very conscious of
Yep.
that. And I, of course, have enough experience now living here that I know what the challenges are. But I think I have to make a note to myself not to forget, you know.
Yeah, 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 of course. Well, that's gonna be an interesting adventure. We'll
Yes.
see how it goes. Also, as your blog is so full of recipes from different regions in Italy, which region do you feel it's maybe underrepresented in the,
Mm,
you know, um, global understanding of Italian cuisine? Because maybe some regions, if you think about Campania and Naples,
mm.
and that's of course everyone knows about it. But what about other regions in Italy?
Yes, yes. Yeah, well, you're true. Everyone knows. Well, partly because of immigration, right? I mean, because so many, for example, in America, I mean, I'm that's my my family came from Campania and Puglia, but most Italian Americans came from southern Italy. So those cuisines are
Yep.
in a sense, better known. Although things have kind of, we'll maybe talk about that later, but of course, Italian American cuisine has gone in a kind of a different direction in a way. But still, those dishes generally are more familiar. Um, but even other famous, I was thinking about this topic because even the so-called famous cuisines, um, they're famous for a few dishes. So, for example, in Roman cuisine, which everyone I think these days knows the famous Roman
Yeah.
pastas, the carbonara, the matriciana, the cacio e pepe, all these. But if you go a little bit beyond that, people don't know the cuisine, right? So, even the so-called famous cuisines aren't that well known. I had like I said last week, I did a post on buttarelle. I had one guy who's another blogger. He's a foodie. He loves Italian food. He goes to Italy, but he told me, oh, I never heard of this.
Yeah.
But yet it's a very iconic Roman dish, right? So that shows you that this familiarity actually is rather superficial, even in these very famous, supposedly well-known regions like Lazio or Toscana as well. I think everyone knows if bistecca alla fiorentina,
Yeah.
maybe they know ribollita, but then you get into some other dishes less familiar. So even the famous ones aren't so well known really. But then there are those. The same thing I think in Milan, for example, everyone probably knows risotto Milanese. But if you ask them what pizzoccheri are, for example, they
Yeah.
probably don't know. But then there are regions that are just off the radar entirely. All right. So, and I think one that I love is the food of Piemonte, for example.
Hmm.
I think very few people outside of Italy would even recognize it perhaps as being Italian. I mean, it's a very, with all of the influence that's from French, etc. Or Val d'Aosta, for example, that kind of cooking. Or even speaking of this fellow Zambelli, the cooking of Trentino Alto Adige is probably not very well known, and probably people wouldn't recognize a lot of it as being Italian, even because of
Yeah, that's a lot of
course, the
influence from,
strong. Yeah.
yeah.
Same thing with the cooking around Trieste and Friuli, that area.
Mhm.
So I think the extreme north in general probably is less known
Mhm.
than maybe some of the central Italian regions that
Oh,
are
yes.
like the Marche, for example.
That's my region. I feel like I
Oh,
wouldn't even, yeah, I wouldn't even like, if one time they asked me like, what's a typical dish from your, from your place? And I'm like, I had to think about it. So I can imagine, around the world, who knows? Who even knows where my region is, No, no one knows.
Yeah, so there are those at Basilicata might be another one. There are some of these kind of Molise, some of these kind of forgotten regions, perhaps, which also have lovely food as well, right? So,
Yeah. Mhm.
um, anyway, so
Yeah.
I just a friend of mine, actually, speaking of Roman foodies, who has a blog. She lives in Rome, and she sent me a recipe for ragù piceno, which I think is from Le Marche.
Mhm.
Delicious, fantastic. I'm going to blog about it because it was really, really good. Then there's Vinci's Grassi, isn't
Oh
that
yeah.
from
Yeah,
Italy as
that's a
well?
long story between, lasagne, vinces grassi, and pasta al forno. It's a whole wow.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. So yeah, there's a whole world out there. I've in my blog, I think I've been focusing mostly on the cuisines that I knew in Italy from my family. So I have Campania, Lazio, Toscana, probably. But lately, I've been trying to go and explore other kinds of food that, again, from these lesser known areas.
You started saying something about the Italian American food. So, as we are, as real Italian restaurants, we are trying to verify real Italian food, real
Mm.
Italian restaurants abroad. How do you think, what's the biggest challenge in doing this, and how did the Italian American food change this, cuisine word, cuisine Italian understanding of Italian cuisine?
Yeah, well, I think you hit that's really the challenge in ironically, I think it's perhaps harder in a way
Mm.
to educate people or to spread the word about, Italian food as it's known in Italy, in countries that have large Italian diaspora populations, because those, like America, but there are other countries as well, um, because those populations have kind of taken the food that they knew from their heritage, and it's evolved over time. I mean, that's normal. Become influenced by the place that it's in terms of looking for ingredients and so on, and just flavors and tastes and preferences and so on. And so it evolves in a way that kind of becomes very different from. And then Italian food in Italy has also evolved, right? So since the 19th century,
Absolutely.
obviously Italians are eating different things from they did back in during the period where there was a huge wave of immigration, late 19th, early 20th century. So that's changing too. So they're moving apart. And so what happens is that, but people living in America, when they think of Italian food, they think of Italian American food often because they know that and it's kind of known to them, and they don't always make the differentiation.
We also
Uh,
talk about the Italian sanding phenomenon.
yeah, I mean, I
Mm.
have my niece's boyfriend came over and I said, "Oh, make me an Italian dish." I said, "Oh, what do you want me to make?" He said, "Chicken parmesan," which is an Italian American dish. I
Ay,
don't
ay, ay.
know it, but obviously not Italian. I said, "Well, that's not really Italian, but okay, if you want it." But that's very typical. And then I'm sure that, tourists who come to Rome and they want to eat, I don't know what. But so as I said, having these, and I think similar things happen though in other countries, not just the States. I mean, I think Brazil, for example, has its own. It's an interesting topic in and of itself, exploring these diaspora cuisines. Argentina is another country, as
Oh,
you may know,
yes.
a
So
very
many
large
Italians there.
Italian, and they have their own kind of takes on many Italian dishes. So I think all of these countries, you're kind of fighting against misperception, I guess,
Yeah.
or competing, maybe. I don't know how to describe it. Whereas a country that has very little or no Italian immigration, probably you have an easier time. Although maybe not, because I think for better or for worse, these diaspora cuisines have kind of influenced the perception of Italian food, even in countries where they're not present. So if you go to an so-called Italian restaurant in Mexico, for example,
Hmm.
it may well be Italian American food, not real Italian food. That's a large part of the challenge. The other challenge is kind of more practical, which is just sourcing the ingredients, and being able to recreate these dishes.
Yeah, of course, because the distance is so much. Plus, it's even I remember when I was there and I really couldn't recreate the taste because food is different, because air is different, because climate is different. So it's impossible to have the same taste.
It's
Mhm.
amazing how things, yeah, the taste just isn't quite the same. Even though you're using purportedly the same ingredients. I mean, the one of the famous ones is, for example, coffee. If you've had coffee in Naples, it tastes like nothing else. Even inside Italy, the coffee doesn't taste the same. There's something that
Yeah, it's
I don't know
different.
what it
The
is.
water, I don't know.
Maybe they say the water, but then
Yes.
they've done experiments where they've taken water from Naples and brought it somewhere else. It still doesn't taste right. But I don't know. It's a
Maybe
funny
it's the
thing.
place, it's the
Uh,
atmosphere, the
yeah.
history. I don't know. But yeah, well, although there's one place well, I lived in Seattle, so I was trying to find some Italian restaurants there that really
Mm.
was able to surprise me. It's called, I think, Ideale, and really,
Ah,
it's it was exactly just like home.
wow.
And
That's
yes,
wonderful.
so I don't know how they did it, but it was great. Anyways.
Occasionally you will find it. I mean, another surprising experience I was in Nicaragua of all places. And I had a good friend who had lived in Rome. She had been the ambassador actually to Nicaragua to Italy. And she knew a restaurant. She had opened up a store selling Italian products, etc. She was married to an Italian guy, so he had contacts, etc. So, and she knew a place, and we went there, and it was, yes, I felt like I was transported back to Italy. So there are these gems out there. Somehow
Mhm.
they figure out a way to reproduce it, which
Yeah.
is
So
great.
what's
And
your
which is
favorite
yeah.
Italian restaurant in US?
Mine.
Yes.
Um, my house, I guess. I hate to
Yeah.
say it, but I don't rarely, if ever, eat out in the United States. Italian. Obviously, if I eat out, I eat things that I can't reproduce at home. But
Really.
but to be honest, I've kind of given up trying to look, and which is why I think the work that you're doing is so valuable because I'm sure there are places out there.
Yeah.
Um, but the question is finding them. And if you don't have the knowledge, then you go through so many disappointments that you get discouraged a bit and say,
Yeah.
oh, forget it.
Yes,
I mean,
yes.
because the other thing is that there was the expense of it. Italian food, for whatever reason, Italian restaurants tend to be quite expensive.
Well,
Uh,
if they use the right ingredients, yes.
yeah,
Unless the
yeah.
ingredients are
But even if
expensive.
they don't, unfortunately, because
Oh,
they're
great.
living off the cachet, of Italian, etc. So they're charging prices that are, not justified by the quality of the food. I don't mind spending a lot if it's justified, and I feel like I'm really getting a wonderful experience. But if it's mediocre, then you feel rather ripped off, no? If
Yes, that's as you said, that's what we are trying to do here to, facilitate your experience. So, you can go to a real Italian restaurant, and if you spend your money, you're gonna spend them because you're gonna get real Italian food. In the past, you said something about the celebration of plenty that I really, really
Mm.
liked, and tell us more about that.
Well, I think that's, my reference is to kind of the immigrant experience, right? So people typically, if you're immigrating, typically and especially in those days, it's because you had a certain degree of desperation, I guess. You were very poor in particular. Um, so people who came here, as soon as they had a little bit of money, I think one of the things, especially for Italians, the first thing you're going to spend your money on is good food, right? So that's a
Yeah.
priority. So, of course, when we went to these Sunday dinners, of course, there was a very good food, but also enormous quantities of food and a lot more and a lot of meat. I think this is the other thing, especially if you look at Italian American cooking, there is a very strong emphasis on meat, even over
Real, it's real.
Italian cooking is, to my mind, a little bit more balanced and among the different food groups. But I think Italian American cooking in particular, even see, dishes that change from vegetable dishes to meat dishes. I mentioned chicken parmesan the other, yeah, a typical example. Classic dish is made with eggplant, and now you have it became veal, I think, at one point, and now it's chicken is the big thing. But that's just one example of how. And then the other thing that's done often here is to take a dish and then add a lot of extra extraneous ingredients to them.
Yeah, just to be,
You know?
more full of
Yeah, just
stuff.
it's all about like overdoing. I mean, from the Italian point of view, it's overdone, right? So there's a dish called Utica greens. You may or may not have heard of it, but it's basically just your typical, greens sautéed with garlic and oil and, in padella, just
Mhm.
basically, spinach in padella, something like this. But they add um, not on cherry peppers that are pickled. They add broth. They add lots of, I don't know, I forget what else is in it. But I mean, it's a whole like five or six different ingredients that go in just to this, what began
So
as a very
you
simple
you
dish.
basically lose the taste of what you're
Oh, yeah.
eating.
I
Yeah.
think they add pecorino cheese as well and something else. So it's like by the end of it, it's like, okay, what am I eating? I don't know. But no offense to my friends from Utica, but that's also very typical. Just like, oh, we have access to all this stuff. So let's throw it in. I don't know. That's a very typical thing. So sometimes it's very hard to get people to come back from that and be simple again.
Mhm.
So that's also very typical, and maybe it's also kind of part of this, just celebrating the fact you have all of this stuff
Yeah,
available. And part of it might be a little bit less on the positive side is the quality of the ingredients always, especially when it comes to fruits and vegetables, isn't always the best.
true.
And so to make up for that lack of intrinsic taste, you add a lot of seasoning, you add a lot of garlic. This is another thing that's very typical of Italian American cooking is, I mean,
Yeah,
garlic. You use garlic in Italian cooking, but not like here that people want to throw in
yeah,
five.
not everywhere, not so many.
Not in everything and not like in the quantities and so on. So again, it's just a lot of it is just, and I think a lot of it is, yeah, it's just kind of like there's a certain exuberance to it, which can be appealing as well. But personally, I prefer the old-fashioned, simple version of these
Mhm.
dishes, to
It's
be honest.
even harder to cook a good dish do if you do it that way, traditionally, because you have
Yeah.
less, you have to be very careful about how much oil are you using because it's very easy to cook if you put so much oil you can't even taste what's underneath. So
Yes,
it's very hard to be
absolutely.
a good cook. Yeah.
Yes.
But as you said, like life and food are so intertwined. And it's very interesting, to think about this topic you brought up because it's true. We were poor, we escaped, and then we wanted to, stop living with that mindset of not having enough. So we
Hmm.
just have too much now,
Right,
which is
right, right.
easier. How do you see your blog changing with it?
Yeah, well, as I mentioned before, how it's changed up to now, I've become
Yeah.
much more, I guess, I would say in general, more professional, if you like, more trying to meet my audience in terms of
Mhm.
having more precise recipes, having better visuals, and all of that. Um, I guess looking forward, the big thing now is video, right? This is what
Yes.
everyone's
Mm.
into these days, in YouTube and otherwise. And that's something I have not yet um, dared to do for the most part. I'm just beginning to toy with the idea. I mean, now, before I just didn't have the time, right? So when I was working and this was a hobby, it still is a hobby, but I mean, when I only could do it and I had a limited amount of time to
Yep.
dedicate, it wasn't even a possibility. Now that I'm retired, I think I'm thinking about it. I'm slowly thinking about doing it. But it would be something that I have to learn almost from scratch, right? I think I've developed my photography skills. I'm still learning those, but now video is a whole nother world.
You never stop learning.
Yeah, exactly. So I'd have to kind of open a new front in my learning. But it might be something worth doing, at least little by little. There are some, and I think it would be useful also didactically, because there are sometimes it's a lot easier to see something made than to describe it in words, right? There's certain,
Yeah.
if you have to use
Immediate.
words, it sounds very complicated, but actually, if you just look at it, it's not so difficult to do.
Mhm.
But trying to transcribe certain actions from the visual to the word is difficult. So even in my current blog, sometimes I link to YouTube videos, for example. I said, look, it's easier to see it than for me to describe how to do
Mhm.
this. So that's the kind of thing where it would be a natural kind of transition. So I've been thinking about it. This new camera I mentioned I bought has very good video capabilities. So okay, maybe I have some of I have a niece, for example, who's very tech
Oh,
savvy,
yes. She
saying,
can help you
oh, a
definitely.
couple of them actually are saying, "Oh, you've got to get into video, etc." So who knows? Who knows? But if I look at the people who do these videos, usually these young guys or gals, not this old retired a guy like me. So I don't know if I can compete.
Well, I mean, there's so much to learn, even for us. It's not really about age, it's about how much time can you actually dedicate to that.
Mm,
Because
mm.
one day there's one tool, the other day there's three, and then this is better, and the other, it's so complicated. So good luck with that, and learn. So we can take a look at your recipes, not only read them. To conclude, if you have to transmit something to your audience, if you want them to take something from your blog, what would that be? Like one, no.
I I think it goes back to what we just were talking about a little bit. It was like good food doesn't have to be fancy, it doesn't have to be complicated. I think the best food, in fact, is food that's very simple but very well prepared. And
Mm,
that to me is the core of what I'm trying to transmit through the blog.
yeah, which also relates to healthy food because you
Absolutely.
don't overdo it and it's not, you know.
And I think in many ways that is the essence of Italian cookery as well.
Mhm.
At the end of the day, it's a very simple, but not necessarily easy because
Oh no.
something simple, well done is not always the easiest thing to do, but it's really, to me, that's the best kind of cooking, whether it be Italian or otherwise.
Thank you very much for this interview. Um, there will be so much to talk about, but anyways, maybe
Hmm.
another time. Tell us again, the link to your blog is
It's, just the name, so it's memoriediangelina.com.
what's gonna be your next?
I'm deciding that today. I again
Okay, so okay.
something for the spring, since spring is right. The first day of spring is this week, so probably some kind of spring dish, maybe with asparagus. I'm
Mhm.
thinking because I
All
have a
right, celebration of spring. Great, I like that. Thank you very much.
well, thank you. You're doing great work.